St. Andrew's website and directions there. So if you come and dress as you are, it's fine. We'll be asked to take our shoes off when we go into the mosque. But besides that, we'll all be together, and we'll get there around 6 o'clock, and we'll watch the Muslims who are there that might do salat. It takes about 10 minutes for their prayer. And Islam Day here was here 2 weeks ago. We'll be talking a little bit more about Islam from his point of view rather than my point of view, and we'll be able to see what the mosque looks like and how that kind of fits into the way the Muslims worship. And then we'll have some questions and answers. So I'm hoping that as many can come, we'll be able to do that. I'm also very interested. This is the last week of this series, and I've been very happy with it. I've gotten good reviews, I think. I'm very happy to do more, to talk more. So if you want me to come to some other church, if there's some other venue, I'm really very interested in doing that. I haven't talked too much about my blog, and I didn't put it up here, but it's a Christian Guide to Islam. And I have business cards. I can give you a card afterwards, which has my web blog address. What I do is every week I write something kind of what we're doing here, something up to date, sort of explaining Islam or explaining features of Islam or talking about things in the news for Christians. You might want to take a look at that and see what that's about. I'm also Islam and a couple of other Muslims that I know are also looking for ways where they can speak with Christians, just interact with Christians and kind of talk with them. So I think that maybe one of the highlights of this series was 2 weeks ago where some of the Muslim women were able to sit down with some of us where Islam was able to talk to the men. I really think, as I've been trying to emphasize from the start, it's really, really helpful for us to meet personally with Muslims. It's very helpful when Christians and Muslims can kind of talk directly instead of trying to figure out what we think and what we believe from the newspaper or the internet or from some third party or something. So as there are ways to do that, if there's a group of people that would like to talk with the Muslim, just sort of what do you believe, what do you think about things. Very interested, and you can talk to me. I'm very interested in trying to set up groups like that. Okay, so any questions about that? I hope we can deep conversation after. All right. So this last week, I'm going to make some suggestions about what Christians can actually learn, how we can benefit from working with Muslims, and then talk just a little bit about how we can kind of get along well in this neighborhood in the United States and in Hampton Roads. So what I want to do first, I want to look at a couple of things in the Quran that I think are very helpful. But I'm starting off with the Bible. And Christians, we like to talk about the Bible as kind of the basis for everything we do. Sometimes Baptists might be a little bit more overt about this. But even Episcopalians, if we're talking about church history and tradition and practice, we want to try to connect our tradition and history to the Bible. At the end of the day, everything that we do want it to sort of fit into the Bible. And but what we do in practice is we have these other things that we hope relate to the Bible. So every week we recite the Nicene Creed at St. Andrew's. Other sometimes we might recite the Apostles' Creed, other people recite the Apostles' Creed. So these things, we hope, are derived from the Bible. The Book of Common Prayer, we hope, is rooted in the Old and New Testament. Our church practices. So I talked a little bit about Sunday services, the sacraments, and not just the fact that we have baptism and communion, but we hope that the way we actually do the sacraments, perform them, also goes back to the Bible. And then these are church forms, kind of how we think about the way the church is structured and organized. Now, we need these things, which I like to call interpretations. The Nicene Creed is really very helpful because it kind of puts everything we believe into one neat little statement that we can recite together. It's something that kind of connects everyone that's in church on Sunday morning. It's something that connects or tries to connect all Christians. The Book of Common Prayer, it's nice to have prayers and words written out for us that we can all say together and help us to worship God. So but all of these things are created with a specific people and a specific time in mind. So, for example, the Book of Common Prayer, as the Episcopalians know, was revised. And I realize not everybody's happy about that. But I hope all Episcopalians can at least recognize that the motivation for revising it was to try to make sure that it's truly relevant and it truly speaks to the modern Episcopalians, right? Even if we're completely honest, even the older Book of Common Prayer, even that was set in a particular era for a particular people. So we do these things, and we sometimes do these things, and sometimes we revise these things and change these things in order to make them more meaningful for us. If you've, I don't know if you've ever tried to compare the Apostles' Creed to the Nicene Creed, but you can see that they're very similar. And it's because the Nicene Creed actually was, I could almost say, a revision or a redoing of the Apostles' Creed in order to make it fit what the church needed. So we create these church forms in order to try to address needs. Now, if we look at the Quran actually is based on the Bible. The Bible, there's a very clear connection between the Quran and the Bible. And what the Quran does is it reinterprets the Bible for a particular generation. Now, I told you in the first week that the religion of Islam is actually very, very close to the religion of Judaism. There's a kind of Christian impact on Islam, and there's differences between Islam and Judaism. But what most scholars think happened is that these Arabs in the 7th century were aware of Judaism. They had Jews living with them. They had come into contact with Christian missionaries, and they weren't comfortable with either Judaism or Christianity. They liked a lot of it. They really did like, especially the idea of one God who's all-powerful and perfectly good and perfectly just. They liked a lot about what the Bible had to say. It didn't quite do everything that they wanted. So they developed this other religion that draws from Judaism and Christianity, but is somewhat different. And the Quran actually draws mostly from the Bible with some changes. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples. First of all, starting off with Psalm 1. A lot of Christians really like this. This is one of the favorite psalms. And in the last 30 years or so, most Old Testament scholars now think that Psalm 1 was deliberately placed first at the beginning of the book of Psalms. While some of the other Psalms might be they might seem to be in a random order, the book of Psalms actually deliberately begins with Psalm 1. Psalm 1 is supposed to be an introduction to the entire book. And the theme of Psalm 1, one of the main themes of Psalm 1, this is the entire Psalm, I put it in bold. Psalm 1 talks about two paths. Verse 1 talks about people are happy. The happy people are those who do not take the path of the sinners. And in the last verse, the Lord watches over the way. The way is another word for the path of the righteous, while the way of the wicked will perish. And there's also this sense in verse 3. The righteous are like trees planted by streams of water, which yield their fruit in season, and their leaves do not wither. And all they do, they prosper. And so one of the ideas of this psalm is that if you focus on the law of the Lord in verse 2, then you're going to be successful. You're going to be happy, and you're going to be at peace. So the right way to go is to take the way of the law of the Lord. And there are things that you want to avoid, sitting in the seat of scoffers or following advice of wicked or things like that. That's the wrong path, and that's the path that leads to a bad result. So probably Psalm 1 is telling us at the start that as you read the book of Psalms, this is really what the book of Psalms is going to be about. Psalm 1 is a deliberate introduction to the book, talking about the importance of following the law and the way of success versus the way of failure. Now, this is the first chapter of the Quran, and the first chapter of the Quran actually takes up the same themes and the same ideas of Psalm 1. And I highlighted this particular important task: guide us to the straight path, the path of those you have blessed, not of those against there is anger, nor of those who are misguided. So the first chapter of the Quran really looks an awful lot like Psalm 1. And I'm pretty sure that what happened was people read Psalm 1, and then they kind of rewrote it. But instead of putting it as the first chapter of some book in the middle of the Bible, they made it the first chapter of the Quran. And so here's a kind of comparison. So the central messages of Psalm 1 and the first chapter of the Quran are very similar. The difference is that while Psalm 1 introduces the Psalms, the first chapter of the Quran introduces the entire Quran. And this means that Quran 1 can orient the reader to the contents of the entire Quran. And that's really, in the 21st century, that's what we want an introduction to a book to do. That's what we want the first chapter of the book to do. We want it to kind of, tell you what the whole book is about, or tell you where the whole book is going. And one of the problems that we have with the Bible is that Genesis 1, I like Genesis 1, but it doesn't really tell you what the Bible as a whole is about. It's not really giving you a good sense of what the whole thing is about. It's just a story of creation. So maybe what happens is that the people who write the Quran decide that it's much better to begin with this thing that's going to give you a clue as to how to be successful. So you follow the good path, you avoid the bad path, and then you're going to get along. You're going to get along very, very well. When I talk with Muslims, this is what many of them draw from the Quran. The Quran is there to kind of give advice, to kind of give you a good clue as to how to be successful and how to avoid problems. Here's another example. The Ten Commandments. I know we're all familiar with them. I don't know if everyone can name all 10. But we agree that this is foundational to our belief. There are some Sundays where in the Episcopal Church we actually read through the Ten Commandments. Kind of basic things that God wants us to obey. Now the Ten Commandments, there's a passage here in the Quran which actually reinterprets the Ten Commandments. Now one of the, I put stuff about this on my blog. One of the fascinating things I find about the Old Testament is that the Old Testament actually has several codes that look like the Ten Commandments, just with somewhat different commands. There's a passage in Ezekiel, there's a passage in Job, there's a few other passages that kind of give sort of a short list of basic fundamental commandments that you should do. And it looks different. Probably there are these different passages that are written for specific, more specific groups of people who are trying to address specific issues. Now, so the Quran, this in chapter 6, and then also it's kind of repeated in chapter 17. Here are the Ten Commandments from the Quran. And they look very similar to the Ten Commandments from Exodus and Deuteronomy. I've talked about a few of the changes. The first one that I think might be most interesting is command number 3. Do not kill your children because of poverty. Now, abortion, I try to avoid more controversial issues, and I know abortion can be very difficult to talk about here. Let me just say that I'm hoping that all of us at least want to think that we want to minimize abortion, and especially minimizing abortion for economic issues. Abortion is not something that's new to the 21st century, the 20th century. Abortion has been practiced throughout human history, or something like it. In the ancient world, what was common everywhere, as far as I can tell, is that if a family was poor or in dire straits, a woman who had a baby, if the family felt that they wouldn't be able to provide for it, or that if providing for it was going to make a problem, it would leave the baby alone to die. And that was not uncommon. We know that that's true from even the very early Christian societies. That if you're poor and you have a baby and the family is having a hard time feeding itself already, then you might consider just leaving the baby, just leaving it out and letting it die of starvation. That's kind of how abortion was practiced. Not exactly abortion, but that's the same practice, and really all through the ancient world. And for the reason that families would do this is pretty much for the same reason that women get abortion today. It could be economic distress, or it could be some sort of social problem, something like that. Now, one of the problems that people who fight against abortion have is that the Bible really doesn't make a really good case against abortion. We don't really have clear passages in the Bible. There's no verse that says, "Thou shalt not abort your child." And in order to make a case that the Bible argues against abortion, we have to do some kind of clever readings, because it's just not as clear as it could be or would likely be. The Quran is a lot more clear. Do not kill your children because of poverty. And this is pretty clearly talking about that issue. You have a child, usually it would be a daughter, and you don't think you can provide for that child, and so you allow it to die. So the Quran is expressly forbidding this. The Quran more overtly stresses justice. There's something about fair weights and measures, and something about special protection for the powerless. So number 7, give full weight and full measure. That means in the ancient world, if you're kind of measuring the amount of wheat with like a stone, you make sure that your stone is the right weight. So you're not going to be cheating anyone. Verse 6, do not approach the property of an orphan. In the ancient world, if you don't have a very strong social code, it might be easy to take advantage of people that don't, of a family that doesn't have an adult male in charge of it. And one of the things about this orphan passage is that Islam teaches that Muhammad was an orphan. Muhammad had a hard childhood because his parents died when he was very young. So maybe that helps Muslims to remember that, look, if the family doesn't have that male provider, then society has to be extra careful to protect for that person.
Number 8.
Yeah.
Be fair in your speech, even with relatives. I love it.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
I like it too.
Does one mean put nothing above God?
I think that's how usually they interpret it. So I think that's the best way. That's the best way to understand it. Don't put anything with God. So one thing that Muslims tend to worry about, even Christians worry about, is some Christian traditions have icons or statues or even pictures, representations of God. And while that's important in some traditions, there are other Christian traditions that worry about paying too much attention to a statue as opposed to thinking about the God who's behind the statue. So I think that's kind of what this association, nothing with God, even in the Ten Commandments, don't make an image, right? Don't worship an image. So the command regarding killing actually allows the death penalty. One of the discussions we have, let's see, number 5, do not kill people except in the cause of justice. Now, when I talk with my Mennonite friends, they insist that the command, thou shalt not kill, really forbids a country like the United States from having the death penalty. That thou shalt not kill means you don't kill people. Many Christians think that death penalty is at least something that we can talk about, something that might be appropriate. So the Quran, I think, is a little bit more explicit. You can't kill people except that if somehow it's just. If someone commits a terrible crime that's worthy of the death penalty, then the death penalty might be appropriate. So what the Quran is doing is it's taking the Ten Commandments and then reinterpreting them or revising them to make things more appropriate for their culture. Now, I'm not saying at all that Christians need to adopt this. I am saying that it's helpful to have this command number 3: do not kill your children because of poverty. We really don't want. I think all of us really do want to avoid or reduce abortions for that reason, because of economic circumstances. Do not kill people except in the cause of justice. Maybe it's helpful to at least have that understanding that thou shalt not kill doesn't apply always in every case. Yes, sir.
Does the Quran specify who decides what's just and what's not? Who's not just?
I was talking a couple of weeks ago about the way Sunni Islam tends to work. So we kind of look to the community to set standards, basically. Now, you can ask a scholar for an opinion. I mean, the question that you're asking is good, and with all of these things, and even with the Ten Commandments, Ten Commandments are these rules, and then we have to kind of get into them a little bit in order to figure out where we draw the lines. That's even a lot of Jesus' teaching, where Jesus says, yes, this is the command, and this is really how you're supposed to interpret the command. So in Islam, usually we're looking to the community. We look to the community as a whole to sort of figure out how to interpret things. When I was talking a couple of weeks ago, I noted that different church traditions do things differently. In the Episcopal Church, it's very, my interpretation, it's very, very top-down. The bishops pretty much make decisions about things, and then we listen to them, or we don't listen to them, but we're supposed to, right? In other church traditions, all members are equal. Even the pastor doesn't have more say than anyone else. So in Sunni Islam, for most Muslims, you're trying to look to the whole community. You might ask an opinion of a legal scholar, but even then, we're kind of looking to see how people in general apply it.
With the Torah and the Talmud and Christianity, you have interpretive volumes. Do they have that which are you've got the companion volumes for interpreting mores and interpretations?
Oh yeah, sure.
Do they have other beside the
There are, yeah. So I didn't talk about this at all. There are there's 4 major schools of law, and then there's a 5th school for the Shia. And these are people trying to answer your question. This is what the Quran says. How specifically do we apply it? So if you go to the Hampton Mosque website, I think they actually have more instructions, mostly for Muslims, about how you behave in the mosque. So they actually, if you're a Muslim, you have to enter with your right foot instead of your left foot, because you want to associate the right foot with cleanliness and the left foot with impurity. There's ways you're supposed to prepare for prayer, wash your hands and so on. So I didn't get into much of that. So there are schools of, the word we use is law, Sharia law, but it's kind of really trying to define how you follow the Quran and how you actually apply it in real life. So what I'm doing here is I'm just trying to point out what the Quran is trying to stress, possibly for their age, the 7th century. Okay, and I noted at the bottom that coveting and adultery commands are missing. I guess to get to 10, they took out coveting and adultery. I think most Muslims don't go for adultery. You can ask them when they're here. All right. Now, this is something I didn't know if anyone has ever heard of this. There's a Christian hymn called "The Love of God." It's in maybe some older Baptist hymnals, and I put this in because this was one of my favorites growing up, and it was written about 100 years ago by Frederick Lehman. And this is the 3rd verse. There are other Christian songs that are kind of based on this. So it's a really lovely hymn. It's really lovely stanza. We would think the ocean fill, where the skies and part can be, where every stalk on earth a quill, and every man scribed by trade. Write the love of God above, would drain the ocean dry, or could the scroll containing a hole will stretch from sky to sky. Now, if you look around on the internet, you'll find that these words actually were taken from a poem written by a rabbi about about 1,000 years ago. This guy in Germany. It's called Akdamut. What most of the websites will not tell you is that Quran 31:27 says, if all the trees on earth were pens filled by the oceans, with 7 more oceans besides, words of God would not run out. God is majestic and wise. So, trees on earth were pens filled by oceans. It's pretty clear that Meir ben Nehorai took the Quran, and took his idea from the Quran, translated it into Arabic, and then it makes its way into a Christian hymn. Quran 31 is really nice chapter. It's a very beautiful poem talking about God and God's glory. Now, I don't, certainly as a Baptist and a Bible scholar, I do not lift the Quran to the level of the Bible. But it still has things that are very beautiful and talk about God, give us images about God that we can use to benefit the church. And this one actually makes it into this hymn that was certainly popular for a while. I doubt that the author, as far as I can tell, the author, Frederick Lehman, didn't know that he was taking words that came from the Quran. He may not even realize that he got this poem from, the story goes, he got this poem from an insane asylum. Somebody wrote these words on the wall. And other people figured out that the words written by this inmate came from the Jewish poem. I doubt that Lehman realized that he got this from the Quran. But the Quran has these expressions that Christians can use, and that we can all kind of work together to celebrate God and God's glory. So now I wanted to talk just a little bit about what the Quran has to say about Jesus before I go into talking about Muslims and Christians together. So the Quran actually states that Jesus was born from the Virgin Mary. But he was not God's son. So somehow Jesus has this miraculous birth, but there's no divinity in him. The Quran affirms that Jesus was strengthened by God's Spirit. The Quran teaches that Jesus performed miracles. And this one is interesting because Muhammad does not perform miracles. Muhammad talks and he hears from God, but Muhammad doesn't do miracles. Nevertheless, the Quran affirms that Jesus does do miracles. It affirms that Jesus received and taught a message from God, and that he taught people to follow God, and that he was executed, but not by crucifixion. And then Jesus was taken bodily to heaven. I'm not sure. I was trying to think through this. Now, when St. Andrews meets, when we celebrate the Eucharist, we affirm that Jesus died by crucifixion. I'm not sure personally whether or how that might matter for our Christian faith. That Jesus died by crucifixion versus dying some other terrible means of execution. Do you know anything, Jason?
Fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy being hung on a tree.
Okay, possibly fulfillment of Old. Okay. All right. I don't know any other theological importance of dying that way versus some other way.
And bearing the cross.
Right. Yes. Right. So the Quran doesn't say that Jesus was buried. Right. It says that he was taken bodily to heaven. So what I think we see here is that the Quran tries to give respect to Jesus and tries to adopt the biblical picture of Jesus while taking away his divinity. So Jesus is an important prophet, and I think it's striking that the Quran insisted, yes, Jesus was born of a virgin, and yes, Jesus did do miracles, but taking away his divinity. Jesus is a human being, and certainly not God's son and not divine. All right. So this really leads to the main disagreements between Christianity and Islam. So first of all, really just about everything breaks down into these three things. First of all, Islam insists on the authority of Muhammad and the Quran and the Hadith. And as I explained in all the way back in week 1, the Quran and the Hadith derive directly from Muhammad. Muhammad recites the entire Quran. The Hadith all go back to Muhammad, either things that Muhammad said or Muhammad did. So Islam pretty much accepts the history of the Old Testament and the history of the New Testament, and then adds Muhammad at the end. So it's not that these other texts aren't important. It's not that Jesus and Moses aren't important prophets. It's just that we're adding Muhammad to make him the most important prophet. The divinity of Christ. So we Christians, we teach that Christ was both God and human, and Muslims insist that Christ was human only. So they raise Christ up to about the highest level of human beings, more or less on a par with the other great prophets. They talk about Moses and Abraham and Adam as great prophets along with Jesus. So just a cut below Muhammad, yeah.
He's cut below Jesus.
Right.
He's not on the level of Muhammad, even though Muhammad is human.
The way the Muslims are, the way Islam looks at it, Muhammad is the highest, and then the next highest, Jesus.
But in Islam,
Oh,
Muhammad
right, yes,
is
absolutely, yes. Muhammad is.
totally
They insist this loudly and repeatedly. Yes, Muhammad is totally human.
and so Jesus is totally human.
Exactly.
So, but they bump Muhammad above Jesus? Or
Exactly.
they're both human, as it happens.
Exactly.
And they're both prophets.
Right, exactly. Right. Jesus is more or less the equivalent of Moses and Abraham. More on that level. So, but that's it. You got it. That's it. Okay. So, and the nature of God. Muslims deny God's triune nature. Muslims don't. They just don't do the Trinity thing. And I could have written also that they insist that it's impossible for a human being to have any divinity. It's impossible for Jesus to be divine or for Muhammad to be divine. You're either divine or you're human. You can't mix. But these are really the differences between Islam and Christianity. Where we agree, and again, I talked a few minutes ago about ethical monotheism. This idea that there's only one God, and the one God created the universe, and God is perfectly powerful and loving and just. The idea that God loves all people and that all people are equal in God's eyes. This is something that of course, is very important. We try to stress this in Christianity also. Human beings should obey God alone, and human beings should be genuinely kind to everyone, even to people of other religions. So this is where we agree. And I think that if my Muslim friends were here, I know that they didn't see eye to eye with me on everything 2 weeks ago, but I'm pretty confident that they would agree that yes, Muslims believe all these things, and most Christians, I think, agree that we believe these things. So it's where we can work together. So we can honor the one true God together. Now, I'm not sure always how we can do this. When President Obama became, when he was when he was reelected at his second inaugural, Rick Warren tried very hard to compose a prayer that honored God, but yet could be said by Christians and Muslims and Jewish people. So we all agree that there's one God who created the universe. Islam stresses, Muslims stress that the God that they worship is the same God that Christians and Jews worship. They insist that we're all worshiping the same God. We just disagree about some of his characteristics. So we may be able to honor the one true God together. It may be possible in some ways to pray together or to honor him in some other way. We're all interested in building a just, fair society. So I kind of wrote this. I think most of us, at least, we want to, I don't know if we all want to make America great again, but we all, I think, agree that it's not a bad thing to either make or keep America great, whatever that means. That we can all be working together to make our country a more just country, a fairer country, a good country. And fighting evil and injustice is all its forms. Racism and terrorism and abuse of border powerlessness. We can all fight against these things, yes.
Is there a hierarchy between the Bible and the Quran as there is between Muhammad and Jesus?
Oh, absolutely, yes. So the Quran is better than for Muslims, yes. The Quran is better than the Bible. So there's two things. The Quran, so Muhammad is the greatest of the prophets, and the Quran comes entirely from Muhammad. Now they will say that one of the problems with the New Testament is that, as Christians know, Jesus didn't write the New Testament. It was written by other people. It was written by other people later, decades after Jesus. And so the New Testament was written by people that were good and had good intentions, but has mistakes. People got things wrong. And I would say honestly that in the New Testament and the Old Testament, it's not hard to find passages that seem to disagree with each other. It's not hard to find passages that seem to teach different things. So, for example, many times in the Gospels, when Jesus is talking about God, you sort of get the sense that he and God the Father are different. You don't really see that they're somehow the same. There's lots of passages in the Gospels where you don't even get the sense that Jesus is God at all. There's this kind of, there are passages in the New Testament that talk about salvation by faith alone, but there are other passages in the New Testament that really seem to teach that you have to behave if you want to go to heaven. So there's actually more disagreement or seeming disagreement in the Bible than there is in the Quran. And the Muslims will say, yeah, it's because there's different people writing, and none of them is Jesus, and they're all writing, decades after Jesus, and so they make these mistakes. So the Bible is good, just not quite up to the level of the Quran. And that's how they tend to explain the similarities between the Bible and the Quran. I'm sorry. So it's important for Muslims that Abraham and Moses and Jesus are all teaching the same message. When we look at the Bible, when I teach the Bible, I say that actually the message of Moses is different from the message of Jesus. They're connected. They're similar, but what Jesus is teaching is a little bit different than Moses, and Jesus seems to suggest that himself. And Islam insists that Abraham and Moses and Jesus and Muhammad are all teaching basically the same thing, and that Muhammad just does it better than the others. All right. Okay, so, and I use this word intentionality. Years ago I used to do, where I come from, we used to talk an awful lot about race relations. And one of the things that was talked about was this principle of intentionality, being intentional. So not just having good feelings, but being outgoing about making peace. And I think Christians have a responsibility to reach out to those who are in the minority, whether we're talking about race or talking about people from different religions. That means it's really our responsibility to seek associations and friendships, and to care for those who might be abused, and also to encourage other Christians to interact with Muslims before making judgments, as I tried to say all along. I'm really hoping that the church at least can get a sense that in the 21st century we really don't have much business talking about Islam until we actually talk to Muslims. In the 21st century, I think that's just too easy to do in order to avoid that. There are Muslims here, and I think now just about anywhere in the United States, we have Muslim populations. So as Christians, we have a responsibility to talk to Muslims before we make judgments. And then maybe we have a responsibility to share that responsibility with other Christians. All right, and okay, so that's all I have for you tonight. So any questions? Yes.
The Quran, as it is today, is it the same as it was when it was written? Was it written during a short period and during the Quran's life? Or is it revisited, or was it interpreted a little different because of language translations?
All right, so the Quran, whenever I talk about there's actually two questions. Is what do Muslims teach about the Quran, and then what do scholars say or surmise about the Quran? So Muslims teach that the Quran was put into the form it's in now about maybe about 20 years after Muhammad died. So what happens is Muhammad hears something from God, and then Muhammad repeats it, and then his followers write it down. And so about 20 years after he died, the caliph, the leader of the Islamic community, assembled all these written things and put them together into the form that we have. Now, the scholars today think that the Quran that we have today really goes back very close to that time. It's almost impossible to figure out exactly how it came together, from a Western scholarly point of view. But it certainly goes back to the 8th century, which is maybe a little bit later in the 8th century, and maybe before. The other thing is that Muslims insist that the only way to correctly interpret the Quran is by reading it in the original Arabic. And so I decided that it was better not to try to read it to you in Arabic. Now but it must be done in Arabic, and that anytime you're using a translation, you're risking kind of not getting the point. So, but we're not going to do Arabic. That's sort of interesting because I don't know any Christian that insists that Christians have to read the New Testament in Greek in order to get something from it. But
One of the women said to me that she did not know the Quran very well because she didn't read Arabic, and she refused to read a translation. So, she just didn't know the Quran, but yet she was very, in fact, she was one of the women covered.
yeah, so that speaks to this idea that you might well get the wrong idea if you're not reading it in Arabic. So sure, but as you suggest, most Muslims don't know Arabic. So I think they disagree. not everyone agrees about how well you can sort of figure out Islam by reading some translation. And there are always discussions about which translation is better for that reason. I think the translation issue is really a bigger issue for Muslims than our arguments about English, the King James, and whatever else. So, yes.
Yeah, I'm just thinking how many different translations there are now for us with the Bible, and that's an interesting point. But theirs continues to be translated, and then they kind of pick and choose which translation. If they don't read Arabic, obviously they're going to decide which translation works for them.
Right.
Somewhat the way we do with New Revised Standard or New English or.
Right. So I think there's just more distrust for any translation that Muslims have than Christians have reading the Bible. So there's a number of English translations, and I mean, obviously there are Muslims that think that it's better to read the Quran in translation than to not read it at all. And yeah, because I guess you're a little bit stuck if you don't read Arabic and you think it has to be read in Arabic, then you're depending on someone else. But there's this, I guess, so there's this value that the Quran needs to be interpreted needs to be read in Arabic. This is one of the things that sometimes my Muslim friends and associates point out, that the Christians may well even be misinterpreting the Bible because we're not reading it in the original language. So, yeah. Anyone else? Yes.
I have a question, just because I haven't taken notes. Is there a chance you might take your notes?
I think they're on the website, right?
PowerPoint? Yeah.
Yeah, all these PowerPoints are on St. Andrew's website. So they're all there. These sessions are all. So sure, yeah. Yes. Okay.
Maybe you can put it out.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right. Any other questions?
We can join. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. I'm very open to it. If I do it here, it has to be okay with the boss. So, but yes, certainly. I'm just very happy to talk about lots more.
I love the idea of being together.